Hello, and this is the Disabuse Podcast. I am your host, James Historiana. And welcome to this very first episode of the Disabuse Podcast. I will be talking about kind of the nature of the podcast and our aims in just a moment. But I wanted to start with the name of the podcast, Disabuse. So to disabuse, for those of you who aren't aware of the term, to disabuse is to relieve someone of a misconception. And a little about myself. Again, my name is James Historiana. I am an independent historian. I am a public speaker, public lecturer, a published writer, etc. A little bit of a provocateur and a polemicist, which is simply to say I have a point of view and I don't avoid sharing it. But I chose the name Disabuse for this podcast because I believe it is the role of the historian and oftentimes the role of the artist, if they are truly an artist. And I do believe that history is an art. That's not to say that there's artifice involved, but there is an art to it. But to disabuse, for those of you not familiar with the term, is to relieve somebody of a misconception. And my understanding is that the history of the word goes back to somewhere around the Middle Ages or so. And we think of abuse today as being some, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, or physical abuse, etc. But back in the Middle Ages, and it makes sense when you think about this, another form of abuse, and something that could also be called abuse, was deception. That you were a victim of abuse if you had been deceived. And so that's where this idea of the word disabuse comes from, being relieved of a misconception. Somebody has abused you by deceiving you, knowingly or unknowingly, but you've become the victim of carrying with you false information. And so I believe it is the role of the historian to disabuse people of their misconceptions. And so that's the nature of this podcast, and that's why the title is the Disabuse Podcast. So a little bit more about myself. My name is James Historiana. As I said, I'm an independent historian. I've had some writings published in peer-reviewed academic journals. I routinely speak on university campuses and to college classes. And history is of utmost importance to me. But this is not only going to be a history podcast. I'm a big fan of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and I'm also a fan of the podcast History on Fire, which I think might be the best name for a podcast ever. I love that name, that title. But this isn't that kind of history podcast because, to me, context means so much. Context is everything. It's another really important aspect of history. But context means having a broad enough view to see how things fit together. And I'm not so much interested in bringing the listener stories about history. That will happen here and there. But something a little bit more broad, something a little bit more interconnected. We're going to talk about history, but we're going to talk about art and culture and film and current events. We're going to cover all sorts of things, and it will be kind of underscored within the context of history. How does it fit in? What can we compare? Maybe something that's happening right now. How can we, what has happened previously that we might be able to compare it to, and the like. So a little bit about me. I am an independent historian and writer and lecturer today, but my journey to getting where I am is a little bit unique, even within the realm of history. And there are all different kinds of historians, and I don't just mean fields and some subfields of history or worldviews. I mean how one gets to the place where they are an historian. Mine's a little bit unique. Many or most historians kind of just take the track of after their high school experience, they nearly instantly go on to undergrad and then grad school if they in fact go on to get their advanced degree. But the point is, it's kind of a streamlined collegiate or academic approach all the way through. And that was not my journey at all. My journey, in fact, for many years, I was an independent musician. I worked for myself, playing music, writing music, playing music, recording music, and traveling the country as an independent musician. And it was great fun. I still enjoy writing and playing music. It's something that's really important to me and something that I will probably always do. But something interesting kind of happened as I was doing that, and I didn't think I would ever do anything else. There was many years when just doing music was all I wanted. But something happened that was kind of interesting, which was I would pass the hours while being on the road, going all over the country, all over the United States, on tour as a musician. And sometimes I would drive. Oftentimes, it was kind of a planes, trains, and automobiles sort of experience. But oftentimes I'd be on a train or riding in a van or a bus, etc., and I wouldn't even be driving. I would simply be, maybe looking at the landscape passing me by, going from, one city to another. But at some point, I began reading, doing a lot of reading a lot of books as I kind of whiled away the time. Is that the right term? Well, I already said it. But, just passing the hours between city to city, between shows, just spending time reading. And in not too long, I discovered a love of reading history books. And in fact, it kind of took me over. And so somewhere in the middle 2000s or so, I had begun loving the study of history, especially American history. I'm an early Americanist. There's all sorts of history I'm fascinated by, but my real field of interest and that which I've spent the most time studying and reading and writing about is the American Revolution and the early American Republic. And if you're not familiar with that term, the early American Republic essentially means the constitutional era through the first several presidential administrations. So somewhere, just after the American Revolutionary War, through the drafting and the ratification of the Constitution, and then the first several administrations that had to wrestle with bringing the new United States government into being and figuring out how to follow the Constitution, where they would, kind of have their missteps. I just find that era very fascinating, and it's fascinating for really good reasons, because I'm also an intellectual historian, which means that I deal with the history of ideas, especially political ideas. And so politically, kind of political philosophical debate is very important to the constitutional era, where you have debates over the nature of government and the nature of individual rights, and where individual rights derive from, and all of these very kind of philosophical debates going on, and that's really fascinating. But the era is also fascinating for some really horrible facts, some horrible details. Of course, the institution of slavery, the second-class citizenship of women, the second-class citizenship of basically all non-white, non-land-holding men. And something that is so easy to overlook now is that non-land-holding white men were second-class citizens for a time in that era. Now, of course, they were the first to achieve enfranchisement are white men who did not own land, and it's really easy to overlook how important of a step that was, because kind of historically looking at white men, it's really easy to just assume they always had it great. But in fact, if you were a non-landholding white man, you were yourself a second-class citizen in the 1780s. And that would soon change, of course, and that change would help to make more changes over the next century and a half. But, of course, a slow process. Anyway, so that's the era of history that I am most fascinated with and have done the most work on. But I'm also interested in the history of Imperial Russia, of Soviet Russia, 20th century history, the Progressive Era. There's just a wealth of history that I am fascinated with, and certain colleagues of mine who will appear on the Disabuse podcast from time to time. Some of those will be themselves historians, and it'll be interesting to talk to them about maybe aspects of history that I'm not as familiar with, or I'm not as disciplined in, and that's why they'll be on here, so they can talk about it in much more detail than I would ever be able to, whether the environmental history or what have you. So that will be really, really fun. Also, there will be other people who will appear who may or may not be historians, but they may be academics of another kind, whether they're philosophers or some other sort of academic field that they're professors in, or what have you. I may also have musicians and other artists on here from time to time as well. There won't always be a guest. Sometimes it'll be like this, where it's just you, the listener, and me just kind of riffing. But it'll be changed up a good amount of the time. It's important to me that we keep things interesting. And so that's what this podcast is going to be. It's going to be talks about history, but we're also going to talk about political philosophy. And I'm going to give you my point of view. And it's more than possible that you're not going to agree with me a fair amount of the time. And that's okay. And in fact, we're living in a time where it's more important than ever for people to listen to each other who don't necessarily agree. We'll talk about issues on college campuses. We'll talk about issues of free speech. Those are issues that are close to my heart. But I'll be honest with you, I read about that kind of stuff, and I talk about that kind of stuff all the time. And so it will not pervade, we'll talk about it plenty for sure, because how can we not? This is the era we're living in. But it's not going to define this podcast. That's really important to me, that is established. I am a huge fan of music, a huge fan of art, and a huge film fan. So we're also gonna we're gonna talk about those things, about why they're important. I'm also a big fan of literature. So in fact, one of my favorite experiences going back to school when I did to pursue this career in history was to see how some historians, some history professors actually use literature, actually use works of fiction, novels, to teach about certain eras. One of my favorite experiences as an undergrad was learning about imperial Russia, 19th century imperial Russia, and doing so through literary works. Fathers and Sons or Fathers and Children depends. The title depends on what translation you read. But Fathers and Children by Turgenev, for example, I remember reading in an Imperial Russia course, and it was just so fascinating because it's a very intimate, familial work of fiction, really defined by the relationship between a man and his son, and you see how the sort of political philosophy, different philosophies were clashing in mid to late 19th century Imperial Russia. And in fact, that's an interesting, it's a book I would highly recommend, even if you've never read any other work of Russian literature. It's very accessible and it's very personal. But speaking of connections between historical work, even a work of fiction, and today, I think actually Turgenev's Fathers and Sons or Fathers and Children is actually a really good example, because that is a book that shows how there was this time in 19th century Russia where kind of radical liberals ended up having children who the next generation ended up being in some ways more radical and yet more nihilistic, so not necessarily more liberal than their parents. And I do believe that is something that's happening in this era. And I should note that when I use the term liberal, I mean it in the best sense. I mean it in the historical sense. I'm talking about liberalism as in the recognition and the celebration of individual rights. I don't use liberal usually in a political context. If I'm talking about the political left, I will say the left. I will not say liberals. And there have been others who have noted this difference, but there is a very important difference between liberals and the left. That being said, I also want to note that I am not a conservative. I have many friends who are conservatives. There are many things about the American conservative tradition in a philosophical context that I really appreciate. As a historian, I have appeared on in the media in a number of ways, and that includes on conservative radio. So I've been able to have really great conversations with conservatives. The best thing about conservatism in the American context, though, is that just ask yourself this question: what are conservatives trying to conserve? And the fact is that conservatives are trying to conserve liberal notions of liberty. So if you automatically think Democrat or the left when you hear liberal, and you automatically think right-winger and Republican when you hear conservative, that's one of those things that this podcast is going to seek to clarify, because those are too simple to be true, and in fact can be so wrong in that sort of identification that it does you more harm than good to think of conservatism simply as right-wing Republican and liberal as simply left-wing Democrat. So reductionist in that analysis that it's wrong more than it could ever be right. More wrong than it could ever be correct. So I am a liberal, small l. I have some libertarian leanings, small l. And that being said, it is my contention that everybody is libertarian on something. And it's those kinds of ideas, those kinds of notions that I'm going to challenge people on And, I'm not saying this as an advocate for the Libertarian Party, because I'm not an advocate for the Libertarian Party. But to make the claim that everybody is libertarian on something, I think is almost definitely true. Probably just about universally true. At least if you're talking about people in the Western world, especially people in the United States. Everybody is libertarian on something. And we can challenge that claim that I just made. In the future, I would be happy to do that. But anyway, that's just a few of the things that we're going to be exploring on the Disabuse podcast. I'm going to leave it there. We're going to keep this first episode short and sweet. Episodes in the future, especially when I have a guest, will certainly run longer. I'm going to encourage long-form conversation. That's really what I'm after. And it will be really, really great to explore these ideas further. So I'm going to leave it there. This was the first episode of the Disabuse Podcast. I want to thank you for listening. The music provided on the Disabuse Podcast is provided by Mason James. To find more Mason James music, go to masonjamesonline.com. And to get more information or to hear more from me, you can check out my YouTube channel, which is simply called Disabuse. And if you want to reach me, you can reach me at my email address, Disabuse.History.HIghway@gmail.com. And we will see you next time. Have a good one. Bye-bye.